A foreign terrorist designation is going to go into effect today for Venezuela's infamous Cartel de los Soles. The White House claims the group is directly tied to the Maduro regime and is responsible for drug trafficking into the U.S. So this move allows the Trump administration to, for instance, freeze assets tied to the cartel as it makes the case for military strikes against Venezuela. Over the weekend, 3 international airlines canceled flights from Venezuela as the FAA warns of a potentially hazardous situation. The idea of military action against Venezuela is something even the president's allies are warning against.
I think you'll see a splintering and a fracturing of the movement that has supported the president, because I think a lot of people, including myself, were attracted to the president because of his reticence to get us involved in foreign war.
Group chat is back. Sabrina, I know you've been following this for a long time. I do know people talk about Venezuela as a narco state, but I don't necessarily, it's not clear whether designating it as a former a cartel, what difference that could make. Can you talk about like what the administration is sort of thinking behind all this?
I mean, for the Trump administration, the designation opens up more options of what they can do in Venezuela and opens a broader justification for them doing things in Venezuela right now. But I think what's interesting, there's a lot of confusion about why exactly the Trump administration would want to get involved in Venezuela and is doing what it's doing. What we hear from the administration, the majority of the time, is the focus on the drug trafficking. The reality is that the majority of drug trafficking is not just through Venezuela, it's through Colombia, it's through Mexico. So the focus on Venezuela raises some questions about why. Now, Venezuela is has the largest oil reserves, proven oil reserves in the world. There's a question about if there is a calculus about what this would mean for the United States domestically if we had access to oil in Venezuela. And I think there's another piece, which is Trump himself has talked so much about migration patterns from Venezuela. So is there some type of interest in destabilizing Venezuela, ousting its leader, Nicolas Maduro, if there's a calculus that would impact the region and if that would impact bringing new leadership into the country?
Yeah, and then in the Times, your paper of record, the Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan came to the Caribbean as the president is said to have reportedly approved plans for covert action there. And I think for the people within the MAGA movement who don't want to be involved in foreign wars, is this starting to walk and quack like a war?
Yeah, so you are seeing the tensions in MAGA just as you saw them just before the bombing of Iran in June. Now, in that case, it was a standoff bombing campaign. That's maybe what you see now against, in the coming days, against drug sites, maybe against military sites. But once you have designated this Cartel of the Sun as a foreign terrorist organization, we've heard from the Secretary of Defense that this opens up options, as you said, and that option may be to go after Maduro as a cartel leader rather than as president of a country.
Right.
Now, it's not sure that Cartel of the Suns actually exists, and that's
rather than a figure of speech.
Right.
Okay, and then meanwhile, I just want to say that people in the U.S. do want to know a little bit more about what's going on. They are hearing about deaths in these boat strikes. Just 24% believe the Trump administration has clearly explained their position on military action. And 76% believe that hasn't been done.
You know, one of the big misconceptions or confusion points is that Donald Trump has gone so far in targeting fentanyl as a crisis. Fentanyl is a Chinese and a Mexican crisis that has very much less to do with Venezuela. So I think the American people are confused about how that campaign trail rhetoric matches up with these actions. And then also going to thinking broadly about the Trump administration. First you had Gaza. He sort of, brokered that peace deal, wanted the Nobel. Now we have Russia, Ukraine. I think for a lot of people, this seems like the third opportunity for Donald Trump, opportunity being the key word, to sort of broker a crisis and solve it. Whereas if you look at polling, I think a lot of people don't want any more crises to be brokered and solved. I think they want Trump to be focusing on domestic policy, the food stamp crisis we just went through, a government shutdown. This feels like an extracurricular thing for a lot of people.
And I think especially because since there hasn't been a great explanation for why and all the things that you just talked about that maybe go up against some of the rationales being offered, it does feel to a lot of people, whether they are in the MAGA movement or beyond America, where we're just sort of like blundering into maybe a war here, and that itself brings up a lot of memories for people of foreign entanglements that are exactly the sort of thing that Donald Trump
Last word
ran
to you,
against.
David. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that they're feeling that way is the president has just not laid out his strategic objectives here. As you said, he said it's about drugs, but you don't bring an aircraft carrier in to go deal with 25-foot skiffs that are moving drugs, right? He has said at various moments that it may be about immigration, but we haven't seen a lot of that. They've denied it's about regime change. And you mentioned oil earlier. That's what the president talks about a lot with his aides.
Yeah.
Now, we do have some American presence in Venezuela, including Chevron. President Maduro made an offer a number of weeks ago to give much more American access to the Venezuelan oil. The president turned it down. Now, maybe he's just negotiating for a better deal.
But people are starting to zero in on that as the differentiator compared to other countries in Latin America.
Joining us now to help break all of this down is Eric Farnsworth. He's Senior Associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back, Eric.
Thanks, Paulo. It's good to be with you.
So just to remind our viewers right now, President Nicolas Maduro, he faces a $50 million bounty from the U.S. government, a massive mobilization of assets offshore that you and I talked about a week ago, and then starting on Monday, this new terror designation that targets him from the White House. So the administration has not really said that their goal is regime change. But at this point, Eric, is there any other way to look at this?
Well, that's probably the most prominent way to look at it, and I think the time frame is shortening considerably. You mentioned the designation of the Cartel de los Soles tomorrow as a foreign terrorism organization. You also have really peak readiness of the U.S. forces offshore in Venezuela, at least shortly. You have the December 10th ceremony of the Nobel Peace Prize for Maria Corina Machado, which isn't necessarily determinative in Venezuela, but it is a data point. And you have airspace being closed around Venezuela. The FAA has warned commercial air carriers to avoid the region until February 19th. So you put all those pieces together, and the fact that the Trump administration is not doing anything to tamp down high expectations that something is happening, and you can draw the conclusion that I think some sort of activity could be in the offering before too long.
I'm glad you mentioned that message that was issued by the U.S.'s FAA. What do you think that could signify?
Well, it could signify a real signal for that action could be imminent of some nature. It doesn't say exactly what it could be. You know, it could also just be a warning to Maduro and the Venezuelan regime that says we could take steps if we want to. It's not a it doesn't guarantee that something will happen, but I think it clears the air, no pun intended, to really, make sure that if something does occur, that there won't be unintended impacts.
So just going back to Maduro now, Eric, I mean, would you see Maduro giving power if we end up in that situation?
I think the only way that he would consider leaving power peacefully would be if he is absolutely convinced that the use of force against him and his interests is imminent. So you have to have a credible threat of force to have a peaceful resolution. And I know it sounds ironic, but that I think is really what we're looking at right now. That does not mean that either force would be used if he doesn't leave, and it doesn't mean that he's going to leave even if he believes force will be used. So it's really, you're playing the odds here. But I personally don't believe he is going to leave unless he is fully convinced that his own interests will be severely impacted and that the use of force is imminent.
Let's explore that peaceful route here, the diplomatic route, as we learned about a week ago that it could possibly involve talks between the White House and Caracas. What do you think would be seen as a non-negotiable for the White House if these talks actually happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we should say that the U.S. administration has denied that they're talking to Maduro. So they may or may not be happening, but it would seem to me, as a former diplomat myself, as a former State Department official, that now would be the best time to actually engage in the type of conversation that could lead to Maduro's departure and the departure of his regime. The red lines would really have to be the departure of Maduro, as well as the inauguration of Edmundo Gonzalez, who is the democratically elected president, who has not been allowed to take office, but Venezuelans voted on July 28th, 2024 for him. He won overwhelmingly over Maduro. He hasn't been allowed to take office. But those would be the two non-negotiable demands as far as I would see it. Now, that doesn't mean that's what the Trump administration will do. They might have their own considerations. But at the end of the day, the whole purpose of a buildup like this is to get to a democratic transition. And the only way, by definition, you can do that is for Nicolas Maduro and his top lieutenants to depart. So I think that really has to be the focus of the conversation.